I'll never be shopping here again. I will submit this review. If I scroll on down, you'll see that that's been added into our customer support database here, and it already has a sentiment rating here, which of course is negative. Hello, my name is Lachlan Kirkwood, and today I'll be teaching you how to build a deep learning model entirely out of no code using a combination of both Peltarion and Bubble. Within this tutorial, we'll be building a sentiment analysis model that will allow us to review and rate the sentiment of customer reviews published on an e-commerce clothing store. I've been sure to include links to everything you'll need throughout this tutorial in the description below. That'll include links to download the dataset, view my Notion checklist, which I'll be showing you in a moment, and also a link to Peltarion's AI platform. As most of the work we'll be doing today is within the Peltarion platform, I'd recommend pausing the tutorial now, clicking on that link and signing up a free account so you can follow along as I create our model. The first thing we'll be doing within our tutorial today is taking the time to download the necessary dataset we'll need to train our machine learning model. But before I dive into that, I just wanted to highlight the Notion checklist that I've created here to walk us through our tutorial. So I personally prefer to just keep a list of all of the items that I'll be needing to add into my Bubble builds within a Notion doc. And what I love about Notion is that it just allows you to check off each individual item once you've finished adding it into your build. Now, I'll be sure to include a link to this Notion template in the description, so you can also make a copy of this and follow along throughout the process. But as I mentioned, the first step in our build here is downloading the necessary dataset and then uploading that into the Peltarion platform, which will then need to map out that data correctly so our machine learning model can digest that data and begin its training process. Now, I've included a link here to a dataset that I'm just hosting in a Drive folder. I'll also be sure to include this link in the description notes of this video below. But if I click on this link, it will open up a Drive folder where I'm hosting a dataset. And the dataset itself is a publicly available dataset that I've downloaded from Kaggle, which is just a renowned library for the machine learning community to download different datasets. And this dataset is just a list of customer reviews from a women's clothing e-commerce store. So what you'll need to do is download this dataset. I already have a version saved on my drive here. And one thing I'd recommend is downloading this file in Chrome, not Safari, because you'll need this folder saved as a zip. And I tend to find that whenever you download the file in Safari, it automatically unzips that file, which of course isn't the file type we'll need when we upload this into our Peltarion platform. But if I was to head over into my file manager here, I have a couple of different versions of this dataset. So I have the zipped version here, and I've also taken the time to extract the zip, and I can see here that within that there is a CSV file. So this essentially is just a spreadsheet of all of those customer reviews. And if I was to open up the actual CSV itself, I can see here that there's just tens of thousands of rows of customer reviews here. And if we look at all of the different columns within this, you can see these are associated with a clothing item, as well as the age of the customer, the title for the review, the actual review text, and this is a field that we'll be relying on when we're training our model, as well as the rating for the actual review. So this is just a sentiment score that identifies if it's either positive, neutral, or negative. So within this data set, someone has classified all of these reviews into one of three options. And this takes care of most of the heavy lifting when we're training our model, because we'll be able to upload this data set and the model will already have a good idea of what is a positive review, what's a neutral review, and also what's a negative review. And then eventually what we'll be able to do is create an experience in our Bubble app where a customer can add in their own review, and then we can send that data through to our Peltarion model, and it will predict what the sentiment is for that review. So is it positive, neutral, or negative? Now, these are the main fields that we'll be relying on within our dataset today. So I'm not going to waste your time running through the rest of the fields here, as we won't need to rely on those. But I just wanted to take the time to quickly point out how this dataset is structured, and we'll also get to review this once again once we upload it into our Peltarion platform. So if I close this dataset here, and then back in my browser, I'm going to open up the Peltarion platform. If you don't have the link, it's just peltarion.com, and I'll be sure to include a link in the description once again. But for this tutorial today, all you need to do is just register a free account. I already have one, so I'm just going to log in with that account. And once we're in our dashboard here, you'll see that I already have a list of existing projects. What I'd like to do though, of course, for this tutorial is just create a new project. And I'll be calling this e-commerce review sentiment analysis. And I will choose to create that new project. And now what you'll find is that the Peltarion platform now requires us to add in our dataset. And what I love about Peltarion itself is it already has a library of free datasets you can use. But in our case today, I've already taken the time to source a dataset for us. So what I'm going to do is grab the existing dataset, making sure I'm using the zip file, not the CSV within that zip. And we're going to drag that zip over into the data uploader. And after this dataset has been uploaded, you'll see it'll automatically provide that with a name. I can then select done because I'm happy with that. And now Peltarion will take the time to not only clean our dataset for us, but also just allow us to map this out within its platform. So you'll see here, it's given us an error warning and it gives us an option to see what data it has cleaned within this dataset. So if we select the go to cleaning option, you'll see that out of the 23,000 rows within that spreadsheet, 3,800 of those had missing values. So that could be something like they were missing the title for the review, they were missing the text of the review, or even things like the department names. So what Peltarion's done is it's automatically removed any of those entries for us, which just saves us a ton of time having to manually review and clean the dataset ourselves. But if I jump back into the table view of our dataset here, you can see that the data overview looks much the same as the spreadsheet that I had just shown you before. So you can see here that within every entry in our data set, there's the title of the review, there's the review text, and then of course there is the rating. And you'll see here under the encoding options that the Peltarion platform has automatically classified what particular data type each of these columns is. So in this case, the title, of course, is text, our review text is also text, and our rating is categorical, meaning there's 3 different category types for our ratings: positive, neutral, and negative. Now we won't need to worry too much about the other columns within this dataset as I mentioned before, but what I would like to explain to you before we move on to creating our machine learning model with this dataset is just how the Peltarion platform will actually leverage all of this data in order to train our machine learning model. So if I just move my head out of the row here and scroll on down to the default split settings here, what you'll see is how Peltarion will split this dataset into different subsets in order to train our machine learning model with best practices. So from all of the 23,000 rows that were valid in this dataset, Peltarion is going to use 80% of that data, so 15,800 examples, to actually train the model itself. And then throughout that training period, an additional 10% of that data is going to be used to validate the training. And what that means is that while the model is feeding in the 15,000 examples for training, it's also going to drop in an additional 2,000 examples throughout that process just to feed it brand new data, so it continually validates some of its assumptions it's making throughout the training process. So you can almost think of the validation data almost like an extended version of the training data. And then finally, you'll see that there's another 10% of the data stored within the test subset here. And what this means is that after the model is trained, it's going to feed 1,800 examples into this model to actually just test to see how it performs and review how accurate it is throughout that process. Now I'm going to leave all of these settings as default. As I mentioned before, Peltarion does a great job at automatically applying best practices, so you don't have to worry about playing around with all of these settings. So what I'll do from here is choose to save this version of my dataset. While that's saving, I'm going to move my head back out of the way. And now we can choose to use this dataset in an experiment. So we'll choose the Use in a New Experiment button. And from here, we'll need to just identify what it is we'd like to achieve throughout this experiment. So for the name of this experiment, I'm just going to leave it as experiment number 1. I can see here that I'm selecting from the e-commerce review sentiment analysis dataset, and I'm going to leave the training splits as the default options. So that was just the different percentage of the dataset that I just walked you through. Then if I select the next option, this is where we can actually choose what the input and output of our machine learning model will be. So as I'd mentioned for our example today, I want to create a model where a user can submit a review for an e-commerce product, and then the machine learning model will take the text from that review, it will parse the content within it, and it will provide an output of a categorical sentiment rating. So that will be whether it is positive, neutral, or negative. So if we select the input of our model to be the review text, which is the actual content of the review itself, once I've selected that, I'm also going to unselect any other options. So by this point, we should only have one input. And then what I'd like to do is select that the output will need to be a rating. And that, of course, is the 3 options for the different sentiment analysis score. Then I'll select the next option. And now the model would just like to know what particular problem type we're trying to solve throughout this model. Once again, Peltarion does a great job at automatically classifying the most relevant option for you. So I'm not going to change it from the single label text classification. And what that essentially just means is that it's classifying the single text entry within our review content. And from here, I'm now happy to create the model itself. So we'll hit the Create button. And this is where Peltarion can get quite interesting. So before we run our machine learning model, right now it's taken the time to create a visual overview of how the machine learning model will run. So at the top here, you can see we have our input data, which is our review text. And then from here, Peltarion's going to feed that into a multilingual BERT model. And if you're not familiar, BERT is the renowned machine learning model that parses text within the Google search algorithm. So Peltarion itself is giving you access to a world-class machine learning model to also train your product in today's tutorial. And then once that model has ran, it will spit that out as an output, which is a rating. And of course, it will cycle through that process until it's properly trained. Now, a great feature that I love within Peltarion is that although it's displaying an overview of its recommended model here, you actually have complete control to customize the model itself. So if I move my head out of the way once again, you'll see on the left-hand side here that there is a whole suite of different machine learning models that you can choose from. So all of these models would provide you with different use cases and outcomes. It's really up to your imagination to use what you think will be most appropriate. But you can see that all of the different models are broken into different categories. So they have different models for image classification, there's different ones for text classification, image similarity, and so on. Now, if you really wanted, you could even feed your input through multiple different models and you could customize that in whatever way you would like. Once again, though, I can't stress this enough that Peltarion does such a good job at automatically taking care of all the heavy lifting for you. So we're actually just going to keep the default model that they've suggested here. And I'll be showing you later on how we can tune and rerun this experiment with multiple different models after we see the outcome of our first experiment. Now, before we actually start to run this model, there's one last setting I'd like to show you, and that is within the settings option here. So this is where we can start to customize the way that this model will run and train. So under this menu, you'll see the option to customize the dataset, which we had already done. So I'm not going to make any changes to that. But if I scroll on down, you'll see the run settings for this model. And this is where I'd like to make a few minor tweaks. So within the run settings, what you'll notice is that the batch size is listed as 32 and the epochs is listed as 2. And what the batch size means is that every time this model runs, it's going to feed in 32 examples of customer reviews, which will allow it to run on a small subset of our total data set, which then brings me to the number of epochs. So the epochs is how many times this model will actually run. What I'd like to do though is increase the number of epochs here to be 100. So right now the model will run through 100 times before it's completed its training. But before I actually run that training, there's one last thing I would like to change, and you can see we're getting an error message for that here, and that is the early stopping of this model. So early stopping is pretty self-explanatory within its name. It just allows us to stop the machine learning model if it identifies that it no longer needs to be trained. So let's say in our data set where we're feeding 32 examples in at once, and it's running through this model 100 times. It might be, let's say, the 50th instance when the model has ran through, that the performance of its accuracy actually hits its peak, so it no longer starts to improve. Now, it's at that point that you would like your model to stop training, because if it's only ran through 50 times and it's already optimized, you don't want it to run through another 50 times, which would not only waste your time, but also the amount of computation you use. So what early stopping allows you to do is add a number of times that this model will run through after its peak before recognizing it needs to stop training. So I'm going to select the option that says run until validation loss stops improving. And now this will allow me to add what's called a patience score. So if my model on the 50th time has reached its peak accuracy, what this patience score means is that it would run through another 5 times, and if it still doesn't improve within those 5 runs, the model will finally stop its training. And so that's why early stopping can be quite a useful feature throughout the machine learning process. And I'm quite confident that it actually will kick in throughout this training set, so I'll be sure to highlight and show you how it looks once we review our training performance. But that is actually the last setting I would like to configure within this machine learning model. So what we can do is actually select to run this model and allow it to start training. And now this might take a little bit of time to run based on your device and internet speed. But once your model starts to perform, you'll see a visualization within the dashboard here, just explaining how it's performing throughout the training process. And the Peltarion platform will also indicate once it's finished training on the left-hand column here. To save you the time though, I'm just going to pause the screen recording now and come back once the model has finished training. Okay, I am back and I can see that my model has finished running here. It took around 2 hours to process just because my internet is a little bit slow. But what I can see here is that the model has in fact early stopped. So that means that after it found its peak performance, it ran another 5 times and it did not improve. So it had stopped the actual training process. But it's at this point in our tutorial now that I'd like to review the performance data. But before we do this, I just want to jump back into our Notion checklist here and just check off all of the items that we've completed so far. So firstly, I'd explained how we could configure the dataset. So I ran us through the process of downloading it, reviewing what data was within that. We then took the time to upload that as a zip file into Peltarion, and then we proceeded to map out that data and just review some of the settings for the training of that data. So I'm going to highlight all of these options and just check those off. And then finally, we had also actually finished the process of creating our model. So we took the time to evaluate the target inputs and outputs of the model. And then we reviewed the visual overview of the model and made a few different tweaks to the settings, such as the number of epochs and the early stopping rate. So I'm going to also highlight these items and check those off. And it's at this point in our tutorial now where, as I mentioned, I'd like to start to evaluate the performance of the model. So if we jump back into Peltarion, I'll take the time to explain how we can actually review all of the data that's displayed within this dashboard. I can completely understand that if you're brand new to using the platform, or if you have no experience working with deep learning, this can all seem quite confusing. So if I scroll on down to the metrics on our y-axis here, the core metric I would like to review is the actual accuracy of the model. And so if I click on that, I can see a graph at the top here, which just explains on our x-axis the number of epochs that the model had ran. So I can see here that it actually had only ran through 6 times, even though I had set the total number of epochs to be 100. So after the first epoch, the model had reached its peak accuracy. And then of course, because our early stopping had been configured to 5 more runs, it proceeded to run through 5 more epochs to 6 in total. And I can also see that the accuracy of this model is 80%, which is quite good for a machine learning model. So this is all pretty straightforward to review. What I would just like to show you though is the prediction inspection option here. So these visualizations explain how the model performed against every single entry within our dataset. So for every actual review here, you can see what our input was, which is the review text. Then there was the target output, which of course was the rating. And then we can identify what the machine learning model predicted. So in this case, the rating of the actual review was positive, and the machine learning model had predicted that it was positive, so it was correct. And then if we were to scroll on down, you can see how it performed across all of the other rows within our dataset. So for this review, you can see that it was a little bit conflicted as to whether or not this was a positive or neutral review. It was only 68% sure that this was positive, but at the same time, it was 27% sure that it was neutral. And of course, you'll be able to see against the actual rating that it was incorrect because this was scored as neutral. Now, you can also view all of the different rating predictions based on the epochs. So by default, it's going to display the best performing epoch, which as I mentioned was the first run throughout the model. But if you just like to see how the model had changed or varied throughout each training run, you can view each individual epoch separately. But the last thing I'd like to show you within the performance review here is just the confusion matrix option, which can be a little bit overwhelming if you have never viewed the Peltarion platform before. But within this matrix, it just displays the 3 different ratings for the actual review that was submitted into the model, and then also the 3 different ratings that the model had predicted. So I can see here that if I hover over the negative rating, there were 130 instances where the actual rating of the review from our data set was negative, and then the model correctly predicted that it was negative. If I then hover over the neutral option, I can see that there were 55 reviews with an actual rating of negative, but the model predicted that they were neutral. And then finally, I can see there were only 15 instances where the actual rating was negative, but the model had predicted that they were positive. And this just allows you to visualize how accurate the model is. So you can see down here that it actually performs quite well on the reviews that were positive, and it predicted that they were positive. It guessed those correctly 89% of the time. Of course, where the model actually struggled a bit was just on the ratings that were neutral. So you can see here that the prediction split across the neutral rating was quite similar across the board. So it might just have a bit of a tough time defining what a neutral rating is. But of course, we can see how this actually performs later on when we integrate this model into our Bubble product. And in order to do that, we'll need to create a new deployment here and then integrate this Peltarion model into our own Bubble workflow editor. But before we do that, I want to just quickly explain one additional feature that Peltarion has within the platform, as it can be quite helpful in taking your machine learning model to the next level. If we jump back into the loss and metrics tab here, as I'd mentioned before, the accuracy of our model was 80%. Which I'm quite happy with throughout this experiment. But what you might also notice is that we'll have a message alert in the bottom left-hand corner of our platform here. If we were to click on this, it'll give us a prompt with some suggestions on how Peltarion could automatically fine-tune your model. So if you were to select to tune this experiment, you'll see that there's a list of tweaks here that Peltarion will offer in order to fine-tune the end performance of your model. And if you'd like to run any of these experiments, all you'd have to do is select the create and run option. I would just like to note at this point, if you were interested in seeing how you can further optimize your model, you will most likely need to upgrade your Peltarion account, just because on the free version, you have a certain number of computing hours that you can use when training models. And running all of these experiments again would need some additional compute time in your account. But for the sake of our tutorial, I'm not going to focus on this right now. This is just something I wanted to point out in case you were interested in getting the most out of the platform. I'm going to though close this and select to create our deployment of our model, which will allow us to integrate it within our Bubble editor. So I'll select the create deployment button here. And now Peltarion will give me the option to choose the experiment that we had created, as well as the best performing epoch, which was the first epoch in our case. I can then choose to create this deployment. And now you'll see the Peltarion platform has created both a URL and an access token. And these will be the fields that we integrate within our Bubble editor when we need to reference this model within our workflow. So it's at this point that I'd like to actually open up our Bubble editor and build out the product that we are going to be creating today. But before I do that, I just want to jump back into my Notion doc and check off a few items in my checklist here just to identify that we've taken the time to evaluate the performance of the model. And then I had also explained how if you'd like, you have the option to use the Peltarion model recommendations if you'd like to rerun that model again. But from here, I'm happy to jump on over into our Bubble editor, and I just have a blank canvas here to get started. But if you've just created a brand new application in Bubble, the first thing you'll need to do is install the Peltarion plugin within the plugin library. So if you scroll on over to the plugins tab, you can see that I have the Peltarion plugin already installed here. But if you didn't, you just need to open up the plugin library and search for the word Peltarion. It's a free plugin to integrate. And unlike most traditional plugins in Bubble, you don't actually need to configure the settings within your plugin menu here. Instead, we'll be configuring these within a workflow editor, which I'll be showing you in detail in a moment. You might also notice though when you're installing the Peltarion plugin that they do actually have two plugins. One is just the default Peltarion plugin, the other is the text similarity plugin. In this case though, today you'll just need the standard Peltarion plugin as we're not running a text similarity model. But this is something that I just wanted to clarify. Now once I've installed the plugin, I can jump over to my design tab in my Bubble editor here. And I'm going to start by creating a basic way for customers of this application to create a review and then submit that into our database. And of course, once it's submitted into our database, I'd like to send the text of that review through to our Peltarion model, and then it will predict what the sentiment rating is for that review. So of course, when I'm working with text, I'm going to add in an input field. So I'm going to scroll down to our input forms and I'll add in a multi-line input field at the top of our page here. I will then also just update the name of this to be called multi-line input review. And if I wanted, I could just drag the size of that out. And while I'm here, I could even add in a text heading above this field. And this could just say something like add a review. I will open up our rich text editor. I will bold that text. And then I could just make the style the standard body. And I'll just make sure that's in line with the actual input field as well. I might also just expand this input field down a tad. And then every time a review is submitted in our database, I might also like to store the customer's name, as well as, let's say, their original order number for this product, so we can use that as a point of reference. So I'm going to copy this heading once again. I'll drag this down so it's in line, and I will update the text that's displayed here to just display the static heading that says name. I'll shorten that text element, and then I'll be adding in another input field below that heading, only this time I'm going to use just a single line input field. I will drag this out on our page, might make that a little longer, and this will be called input customer name, and I can then highlight both the heading and the input field, drag these across, make those roughly in line there, and I would like this input field to store the customer's order number that they're leaving a review for. So I'll update the name of this to be called input order number. And because we're storing a number, I'll just need to update the content format for this input to not be a text field, but instead be an integer. I can then update the heading here to display the word order number. And this will just be a text field. I'm not going to worry about making that an integer. I'll update the heading here to display the word order number. I can then bold this text in our rich text editor. I'll save that. I will just expand that heading out. And then I'll also just reduce the size of our review input field just so it's in line with our second input field there. And of course, below all of these input fields, I'm just going to add in a button element that will allow a user to submit this review. So I'll just type the word submit on this button, just making sure it's also in line with our other input fields. And I might actually just move those up a tad as well. And after adding in all of the input fields, this is where the fun can begin. We can now build out the workflow and leverage the Peltarion model that we've just built, so that every time a review is created and a user selects the submit button, we send that data through to the Peltarion model, and it will return a value based on what its sentiment rating is. So is this review a positive review, is it negative, or is it even neutral? So in order to obviously store that data within our database, we're going to need to create a data type. Now I've already created this, so if I jump into my data tab here, I have a data type that's just called customer review. So every time a review is created, I'm going to create a new entry in my database here. And within this data type, I have 4 different fields. There's the customer name, which is just a text field. There's the message, which is just the actual review itself. So that's the content that a customer will write in that multi-line input field. Then there was the order number, which is just a number field. And then finally, there is the sentiment of the review. So this will be the rating that the Peltarion model will return. And this is just going to be a text field, because of course this will display one of 3 text options, positive, neutral, or negative. But it's at this point that I just recommend you pause the tutorial and create the exact same data type and data fields as my customer review here, just so you can follow along as I start building out the workflow. So from here, I'm going to jump over into our design tab, and I'm going to create a new workflow every time the submit button is clicked. And within this workflow, the first thing I'll be doing is selecting from our data tab, and I'll be creating a new thing. So the thing I'd like to create is a customer review. I'll just drag this workflow editor across. And then the fields I'll be editing is first of all the customer's name. I would like to store the value of the input customer name field. Then there was the message. So this is the content of the review itself, which is the multi-line input field review, its value. And then finally there will be the order number, which will be the value of the input order number. And then at this point in time, I won't be making any changes to the sentiment score of this review yet, because in order to do that, I'm going to need to send this review through to my Peltarion model. So I'm going to need to add an additional step to this workflow, and I'll type in the word Peltarion here. And now you'll see a list of custom fields that you can add in. And this might seem a little overwhelming if you haven't used the Peltarion plugin before, but I'll be walking you through all of the different steps and fields that you need to implement your model that we've just created. So as you can see, the first field that I'll need to add in is the URL of the Peltarion model. So if we jump over into the Peltarion platform, I can simply just copy the URL of my model here, and then I'll just need to jump back into Bubble and paste that in. It'll be the same process for my token field here as well. I'm just going to need to copy the access token within my Peltarion platform, and I'll just paste that in. And then for the key field, this is actually stored within our Peltarion platform as the input name. So at this point, the plugin will just recognize that we're adding in some review text. Now you'll need to copy the exact value within this field. So if you have capitalized letters, you'll need to make sure they transfer across, as well as any spacing. I'm going to copy that value and paste that into my key 1 field here. And now because the Peltarion plugin knows that I'm going to be sending through some review text, I'll need to actually classify what that text will be, so it has an entry to run this model on. So the value of our review text will actually be the value of our message field in step 1 of our workflow where we had created the review. So if I jump into the Peltarion step here, I'll select that the value will need to be the result of step 1. So that's the first step in our workflow. It will be the message field, which is the review text that's stored in our database when that review is created. And then finally, I'll just need to update the type of key and value that we'll be using in our Peltarion model here. And this is just going to be a text type. And that's actually all we'll need to configure within this plugin. As you can see, there's a myriad of different fields that you can choose to add if you're running multiple different models within one workflow. But for our tutorial today, things are pretty straightforward. So that's all we'll need to add at this point in time. Of course though, once this model actually has had the chance to run and it returns a value based on what the sentiment rating is for this review, we'll need to then store that value within the customer review that we had previously created here. So in order to do that, I'll be adding another step within our workflow, and I'll choose from our data tab. Only this time, instead of creating a new review, I'm going to make changes to the existing review. So the thing I'd like to change is the result of step 1. So that's the step in our workflow where we were creating that review. What I'd like to do is change the sentiment rating, which was just a text field. And I would like the value of this to now be the result of step 2, which is where we were running the Peltarion model. And I'll be selecting from its key. So that will be the value that it returns. And now this means that within our database, we'll be able to store a relevant sentiment rating based on each new review. But while we're here working on the workflow itself, I'm going to add an additional step to reset the input fields that we have stored on our page. So I'm just going to select from the element actions, and I'll choose to reset the input fields here. So I'll select the reset inputs option. And if I really wanted to try and polish a few things up throughout this process, I could also add an alert message that displays to the user just to let them know that their review has successfully been submitted. So I'll quickly just jump over to my design tab. Under our visual elements, I'll select to add in an alert. I'll just drag that out anywhere on our page. I can update the alert message to say review submitted. And I would like to select to position this alert at the top of our page. I could also make that a tad smaller. And of course, if you've used alerts before, you'll know that these don't display until you actually reference them within a workflow, and then they'll temporarily fade in and out. So back in my workflow, I'm going to need to reference this alert message. So I will once again scroll down to our visual elements. I'll choose from the alert option and select to show a message, and it will automatically select the alert that we've just created because it's the only one on our page. And that is all we'll need to create within this workflow. As you can see, it's actually a pretty straightforward process to integrate your deep learning model within Bubble. But now before we actually test this model itself, what I'd like to do is just create a repeating group below this, which acts a bit like a CRM for our customer reviews. So within that, I'd like to just display the name of the customer, the review they've left, their order number, and then of course a sentiment rating for that review. And then I'd like to explain to you how we can create a custom state on that repeating group that allows us to filter only the negative reviews. So that way, let's say if you have a customer support team, they can start to triage the most urgent reviews which need addressing. So as I mentioned, I'll be adding in a repeating group onto this page. I'm just going to drag it out across my whole page. I'll be selecting that the type of content will need to display customer reviews. And for the data source, I'm just going to perform a search through my database for all of the customer reviews. I'm not too concerned about adding any sorting on these yet, but I could also just update the layout style to be extended vertical scrolling and the number of rows to be 2. And now I can start adding in some dynamic elements into my repeating group. So I'm going to drag a text element out here, and I would like this text element to display the actual message of the review. So I'll select to display the current sales review, its message. I will also just update the style of this to be body, just so it's positioned to the left-hand side of my repeating group. And I'll just move that up to the top there. And while I'm here, I'll also just reduce the height of that text element. That, of course, will automatically expand down if it needs to. And above this element in our repeating group, I could even add a text element outside of our repeating group. And this could just act as a heading. So I'll update this to just display some static text called review message. I'll once again just make this the body style. I'll open up my rich text editor and just bold that heading. And I'll move these across on my page. And now I'll just be able to clearly see that within the field of our repeating group here, this is the review message. Then beside this text in our repeating group, I'm going to copy the message of this review. I'll drag this out to the right hand side, and I'm going to want to display the sentiment rating for this review. So I'm just going to update the message field to now display the sentiment field. And I can reduce the total width of this text element just because that's going to be one word. So it'll be positive, neutral, and negative. So it won't actually take up much space within our repeating group. I'll also just need to make sure it's not overlapping with our existing text field, which is the customer review. And then I can copy this heading once again. I'll drag this out so it's in line. And then I will update this text to display sentiment rating. I'll then also just reduce the width of that heading. And now beside this, I'm going to add 2 additional fields, which of course will be the customer's name as well as their order. Just so let's say if we're working in the customer support team, we have some additional context about who the person is that left this review, as well as what particular order they were leaving that review for. So I'm going to once again just copy this text element, drag this across, making sure it's in line. I'll expand this one out a tad. And I'm going to update this to be the customer's name. I'll then copy my heading. I'll also drag this across. And I'll be updating this static text to display the customer name. And then finally, the last field I'd like to add within our repeating group here. Before I do that, I'm just going to need to expand that outwards. Is just the order number for this review. So I'm going to drag this field out. I can reduce the size of that. And then I will copy this heading one last time. Drag this across, making sure it's in line. And this will display the word order number. And then I'll need to update the dynamic text field that I'm displaying here. So it's going to be the current sales customer review, the order number for that review. And look, while I'm here, if I really wanted, I could also expand my page out just so I can give some additional space within my repeating group and add in, let's say, a button element. And if you're creating a customer support dashboard, this button could display something like mark as complete, because this means that they have followed up with that customer about their review. Particularly if it's a negative review, you might want to immediately just make contact with that customer and see if you can find out some additional details about why their experience was negative. I might also actually just remove the word as, just so it says mark complete, so that text can be on one line. Drag that out a tad. And then I will close the element inspector, just select all of my text elements, move those down a tad so they're in line with my button here. And I'll just move that there. I can reduce the width of my repeating group and also the width of my page. And then of course I can close off the empty space at the bottom of my repeating group here, just so that there isn't any blank spacing between each individual input. So after we finish adding in the repeating group here for our customer support dashboard, let's just go ahead and preview what this whole experience looks like. So that way we can see how a review can be created by a customer and then submitted into our support dashboard, as well as throughout that process be allocated a sentiment rating from our Peltarion model. But before we go and preview our development environment, there is one thing you'll need to do within your Peltarion platform, and that is just select to enable your model. If you don't do this, the model actually won't function. But once we've finally enabled that, we can jump over into Bubble and select to preview our application. Now, as you can see here within my editor, I already have some existing reviews that I have previously added in. And right beside this, you can see that it has the sentiment rating for those reviews, as well as the customer name and an order number. What I'd like to do though, of course, is just show you how this functions when a new review is created. And if you're creating a new review, I'd recommend that you just keep the context of the review itself around the e-commerce use case, because the dataset we used to train our Peltarion model was trained on e-commerce reviews, particularly for women's clothing. It's going to provide more accurate responses based on any text that's relevant to that data. So I'm going to add in a new review here, and I'm going to say the dress was a great color and a perfect fit. Very happy. I can add in my name. I'll call myself Kim Possible. And I will add in an order number. I'll just add in a few different characters. And now I can choose to submit the review. you'll see that it automatically adds that entry into our database. And at this point in time, it doesn't have a sentiment rating, which of course is because it's sending this review through to our Peltarion model, and it's parsing the text that was added into this review. And from there, it will of course return a sentiment rating, which you'll now see has just appeared. So you can see that the sentiment rating for this review is positive. And one thing I would just like to point out is that the first time that you run a review, it will be quite slow, just because it actually needs to fire up the machine learning model that we've created. So if we were to add in another review now, you'll see that the process will be a little bit faster. And in this case, I'm going to add in what I would personally find to be a negative review. I'll say the dress was stained when I opened the box. I'll never be shopping here again. My name here can be Karen Smith, and I'm going to add in just another random order number. I will submit this review. If I scroll on down, you'll see that that's been added into our customer support database here, and it already has a sentiment rating here, which of course is negative. And so it's at this point that you can really start to see the power of integrating a deep learning model into a Bubble application like this. I think this is a great real-world use case, particularly if you are working in the e-commerce space. But before I finish the tutorial today, I want to just explain how we can take this experience to the next level. So at the moment, we have a list of all of our customer reviews here. And let's say you have a dedicated customer support team, or you're running customer support yourself, and you'd like to just get in touch with anyone who's left a negative review, just so you can try and triage that customer relationship. What we can do is create a filter on this repeating group to only display those reviews that have a sentiment rating of negative. And this is actually a fairly straightforward process to use using a custom state within Bubble. So if we jump back over into our Bubble editor, what I'm going to do is just highlight all of the headings above our repeating group, as well as the repeating group itself, and just move that down a tad on our page. And then I'm going to add in a button above our repeating group that just says filter by urgent. And essentially what I'd like to do is create an experience that when this button is clicked, it only displays the reviews where the sentiment rating is negative. I might also just drag that button across so it's in line with all of our text there. And now in order to identify when I would like to filter these reviews by the urgency, what I'm going to do is create a custom state on our repeating group here. So I'm going to open up our repeating group. I'm going to select the information icon, and I'd like to add a new custom state, and I'll be calling this urgent filter. The state type will be a yes/no state, because I either would like to display those reviews that are urgent, or I won't be displaying those reviews that are urgent. So I'll choose to create this. Now, by default, I would like to display all of the reviews, not just those that are urgent. So I'm going to select the default value of this custom state to be no, which means I'll need to just create a way to update the state status to yes when our filter by urgent button is clicked. And when that status has been updated, I'd like to change the data source of this repeating group to only display the reviews where the sentiment rating is negative. So I'll start by creating the workflow to change the state when our button is clicked. So I'll choose to start edit a workflow, and then within this workflow, I'm going to type in the word state, and I'll choose the set the state of an element. The element I would like to set the state for is our repeating group, and the custom state is of course our urgent filter. In this case, I'd like to update the state of the urgent filter to be yes, meaning we are now filtering only the reviews that urgently need attention. And now as we're switching this custom state to yes, I'd just like to add a condition onto the workflow trigger here that only allows this to run when the state is currently no. So I'll be selecting from when the repeating group customer review, its urgent filter, when its value is no, this workflow will now switch this state over to yes. And I can just update the event color of this workflow to be green, because in this case we will be switching the status of that state to yes. And now of course what I'll need to do is just create another workflow that recognizes when that custom state is yes, and then it will change the state over to no. And to streamline this whole process, I can just choose to copy this existing workflow. I'll paste this in. I'll update the color of this to be red so I can tell the two apart, because in this case I'll be switching the custom state to no. And I'll just need to update the condition to recognize when the urgent filter state is yes. And then in this case I'm just going to be switching it over to no. And that's all of the workflows we'll need to create throughout this experience. If I jump back into my design tab, what I can do is then open up my repeating group and create a condition that recognizes when that state is yes. And then I'll change the data source to only display the reviews where the sentiment rating is negative. So I'll select from our conditional tab, I'll define a new condition, and I'll recognize when the repeating group customer review, its urgent filter is yes. And when that condition is true, I will update the data source. In this case, I'd like to search for all of the customer reviews in my database. And in this instance, I would like to only display the reviews where the sentiment equals, I will backspace the option to add in dynamic text. And then I'm just going to manually type in the word negative, because that is the value that is returned from our Peltarion model. I'll also just need to make sure that there's no capitalization in this word here, just because that's the way the value is being stored in our database. And now finally, the last thing I'll need to do is just update the text that's displayed on this button when the custom state is also switched to yes. Because at the moment it's displaying filter by urgent, but when we are displaying all of the urgent reviews, I'd just like to display the option to filter these by all of the reviews once again. So I'll define a condition, and I'll recognize when the repeating group, its urgent filter custom state, its value is yes. I'll just update the text of this button to display the words filter by all. And of course, if you're familiar with using Bubble's conditions, you can toggle these on and off to see what the changes will look like. But that's all we'll need to create throughout this experience. I should just note that this isn't completely necessary if you are just experimenting around with the model, but I just wanted to take the time to explain how you could get the most out of your build today throughout this tutorial. So if we go and now preview our Bubble application once again, and if I scroll on down to my customer support dashboard here, I can just see that all of my reviews are just displaying in chronological order. But if I was to select to filter these by urgent, it's now only going to display the reviews where the sentiment rating is negative. And if I once again select to filter these by all, it's going to just revert back to displaying all of my customer reviews. Back in my Notion doc now, I'm going to just check off that I've finished not only deploying our Peltarion model today, which included, of course, integrating all of the workflows throughout the process, but I've also explained how we could build a customer dashboard with a filter that allowed us to refine the reviews that we were displaying to filter out only those with a negative sentiment rating. And just like that, we've finished the process of building our own deep learning model, which allows us to create a sentiment analysis on customer reviews from an e-commerce store. As you can see, it's never been easier to create your own powerful deep learning model without writing a single line of code using a combination of both Peltarion and Bubble. Throughout today's tutorial, I honestly only touched the surface of what's possible with Peltarion. If you were even interested in learning what else is possible with their platform, I'd recommend heading over to their website and checking out the tutorial section. They have a great list of both written and video tutorials that are easy to follow. And they just explain how you can build other powerful machine learning models like image recognition, more text-based similarity use cases, or even predictive models. What I love about their tutorials is that they're quite easy to follow along with, and I even used a few myself when I was first getting up to speed with their platform. But if you enjoyed this video, be sure to hit the subscribe button to see all of my future Bubble tutorials. And until next time, I wish you all the best on your own no-code journey.